It's the Growing for Market podcast.
A lot of folks who want grants think that they're not going to be able to get a grant unless they hire a grant writer. Grant writers can be expensive. And honestly, I'm 20 plus years into all of this work. I've only just started paying for some grant writing support because no one can tell your story like you can. You know the passion and mission behind what you want to do, and only you can articulate that. And honestly, until you can articulate it, you probably won't be funded. You got to become a really good storyteller and ambassador to the good work that you're doing. So roll up your sleeves. It's you that's going to write the grants for a while. Someday when you're doing well enough and you can justify that ROI in the investment of a grant writer who needs to match your skill level, then maybe you can afford a grant writer. But that's my 2 cents.
Hello, and welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, where we talk about growing, marketing, and the business of growing vegetables and flowers for local markets like farmers markets, CSAs, farm stands, and local wholesaling. I'm Andrew Mefferd, your host and the editor of Growing for Market magazine for 34 years, the magazine for flower and vegetable market farmers. If you're enjoying the podcast, just wait till you see the magazine. Go to growingformarket.com for more. Also, if you could give us a follow and a rating, it really helps other like-minded people find the podcast. And now, let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. Today's episode of the Growing for Market podcast is brought to you by BCS America. On our farm, we've had our BCS two-wheel tractor for over a decade, and with no belts to slip, its all-gear-driven construction is still going strong. Though we originally got it for rototilling, we kept it even when we went mostly no-till because it can do so many other things around the farm. From snow blowing, to making raised beds with the rotary plow, to chipping wood, it can do just about anything you might need on a farm with the right attachment. Need to shred a cover crop? A BCS flail mower will make quick work of even the most vigorous cover crop and chop it up so it breaks down quickly. Want to stir in compost or amendments without inverting soil layers? A power harrow turns your BCS into a precise tilthing machine with depth control so you don't mix deeper than you want to. With so many attachments to choose from, it truly is the Swiss Army knife of farm implements. It's why, instead of saying two-wheel tractor, so many people just say BCS. Tractors and attachments are on sale through the end of the year. Visit bcsamerica.com to find sale pricing and your nearest dealer. Harnois Greenhouses has been pioneering greenhouse design since 1965, working alongside market gardeners and farmers across North America to deliver turnkey greenhouse solutions. Their mission is simple: supporting growers' success with innovative, high-performance structures engineered for strength, efficiency, and longevity. Designed to withstand high snow and wind loads, their greenhouses optimize brightness, boost yields, and offer a rapid ROI. With over 20,000 projects completed, they're more than just a manufacturer. They are a trusted partner in building sustainable, energy-efficient growing environments. Their NRCS-approved freestanding greenhouse, the Ovaltech, remains a top choice for year-round production. And in 2025, they're introducing a new low-tech high tunnel, starting at just $2 per square foot, perfect for growers seeking an affordable, durable solution. As a Growing for Market listener, you'll receive an exclusive 5% discount on all new structures. Harnois Greenhouses, leading the way in turnkey solutions for local growers. Check them out at harnois.com. That's HARNOIS.com. Spring is here, and CSA season is in full swing. If you're ready to grow your CSA and reclaim your time, Farmhand is here to help. With built-in marketing and subscription tools that automate everything from customer support and newsletters to weekly add-ons and billing, Farmhand helps you delegate the busy work so you can stay focused on the farm. On average, Farmhand saves CSA farmers over 10 hours a week. That's 10 extra hours to spend with your family, in the field, or just taking a well-earned breather. Set up a one-to-one demo with Ari, Farmhand's founder and a farmer himself. He'll show you exactly how to streamline your operations, grow your CSA, and stay competitive, all with tools designed for small farms. Make this your most profitable season yet. Get started at farmhand.partners/GFM. That's farmhand.partners/GFM. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Amber Lambke to the Growing for Market podcast. Amber is the co-founder and CEO of Maine Grains Incorporated, a grist mill housed in a repurposed jailhouse, which has spurred the revival of grain production here in Maine. And I should point out, that is based in Skowhegan, Maine, which is just 5 miles south of my farm in Cornville, Maine, which is where Growing for Market is based. Amber was also the founding director of the Maine Grain Alliance, a nonprofit formed to preserve regional grain traditions from earth to table. So, without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Amber.
Thanks, Andrew. Great to be with you in a professional capacity and as your friend.
Yes, I should point out that not only we are 5 miles apart, which actually we could have done this in person and that would have probably been more fun, but we actually found that it's easier to get better sound quality just with us in our own little studio rooms. When we were first starting this pod, talk about test runs, we did a few live interviews and there was just, it's like the other person's mic would pick up the other person and you get feedback and all kinds of weird stuff. So it's actually better sound quality to do it the less fun way like this. Although, yes, if you're at home or at work, you're about 5 miles away from where I am right now. So, okay.
Good to be with you.
Yes, likewise. Okay, I've been wanting to have you on the pod for a while because your projects are such a great example of local foods projects that are making a real difference in the community. But what pushed me over the edge to ask you now was the way that you have a for-profit and a nonprofit that support each other. And the thought that other growers out there might want to do a for-profit and nonprofit partnership. So I want to let the audience know that we are also going to discuss the details of how a for-profit nonprofit can work together in case other farmers might want to explore the same thing, say for a project they've always wanted to do for their farm that might not make financial sense, like founding a nonprofit to raise funds for free CSA shares from their farm or to facilitate a community garden or something else good for their community. So I have a farm project that I think might be able to benefit from this kind of partnership, but I'm going to save my project for later because I want you to tell everyone about Maine Grains and the Maine Grain Alliance first. So can you tell us about Maine Grains and the Maine Grain Alliance, and how did you come up with the idea to start a grist mill in an old prison?
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to back way up to sort of where this all started because I am not a farmer. I am not a grain miller. I was not even a professional baker when these ideas came about. So really, I was plugging into Skowhegan's redevelopment as a citizen and a volunteer. And I was giving of my time to our local farmers market because I cared deeply about it. And I cared about the success of farmers here and about eating and having access to great organic food. So in that process of getting to know the farmers market and the farmers in this area and going to farmers market conferences, we realized that the rules around participating in farmers markets in Maine, that you grow or produce everything that you bring to a market, were being exempted for bakers, which are anchor members of farmers markets, because of the assumption that you couldn't get the primary ingredient, grains, from Maine. And that was a head scratcher for some bakers who were saying, wait a minute, I know that in good farming here in Maine, we grow rye and buckwheat and oats as a cover crop. So why aren't we processing those things into food? So really, it was that question that prompted the first gathering of a grassroots group of bakers and farmers and millers at the first and annual Kneading Conference, KNEAD, where we asked those questions. What would it take to grow more grains in Maine that would be available to bakers? What we learned at that first conference in 2007 is that there were grains being grown in Maine, and that really the problem we had was an infrastructure problem. We did not have the machines to clean and process grains or even crack that husky coating off of oats to be able to eat the edible groat on the inside. So really, that was the problem we identified. And if you research the history of grain growing in Maine and the Northeast, we were robust producers of grain back in the 1800s. The quote I like to share from this community is that back in 1837, there were 239,000 bushels of wheat grown in this county, Somerset County alone. At 60 pounds to the bushel, that was enough to feed over 100,000 people in a community that right now is 50,000 people. So you can think of Maine and some of the other New England states as a net exporter of grains at that time. So really, this spurred our thinking. It spurred our thinking about how to solve this infrastructure problem. And my business partner at the time, Michael Scholes, and I got to work visiting any little mill or big mill or medium-sized mill we could see to figure out who could do this milling for Maine. And if others couldn't, then we would. And so ultimately, what we had seen in Rhode Island, Vermont, Massachusetts were really folks milling on farms or milling in historic structures in a museum quality milling. So if you can imagine Gray's grist mill, for example, down in Rhode Island, or Littleton Mill in New Hampshire, they were reviving water milling for the sake of teaching, but not so much milling enough to feed a community. So the infrastructure we saw was quite fragile, and ultimately decided that we would want to build a mill here in Skowhegan to help solve Maine's infrastructure challenges.
Right.
That was the impetus. And I know we're going to get into discussions about nonprofits and for-profits. And so really, I just want to stress that it was some of that volunteer work and problem-solving work that started the nonprofit first. We wanted to keep hosting this conference. We wanted to keep having conversations about problem solving. The Kneading Conference became an annual event. So we formed the Maine Grain Alliance to house those educational activities and outreach. Later would come the mill, and we formed that as a for-profit company.
Okay, that was going to be one of my questions, which you already answered, is if one came first. Okay, so you were doing the Kneading Conference. Was the Kneading Conference first, and then you formed the Maine Grain Alliance?
That's right. The Kneading Conference was 2007. At that time, we just knew we wanted to have a conversation and a conference and bring bakers together. We didn't know yet if we wanted to form a nonprofit or not. We didn't know if the events and activities would need to continue. So at that time, we partnered with Heart of Maine Resource Conservation and Development out of the Bangor area, and they were able to receive donations for us. They provided some staffing support to help get our conference off the ground. Once it was clear that the Kneading Conference was a hit and people were going to want to do it again, and we sort of raised a stir in Maine that was interesting to folks, then we started realizing that this will need to be its own nonprofit in order to do our own fundraising and put together a year-round slate of activities. So as with any kind of capacity building, that takes some time. The official nonprofit for the Maine Grain Alliance was finally formed and received in 2010. And that allowed us to no longer need a fiscal sponsor to receive donations, and we could receive tax-deductible donations ourselves.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for that explanation. Just thinking about perhaps trying to form a nonprofit, and for people in our audience, I think that's helpful. I want to tell you a quick story about the Kneading Conference that I may have told you before, but our audience probably hasn't heard.
Okay.
So, or maybe you haven't. I'm not even sure if I told you this. So I'm trying to think of what year this was. It was maybe 2008 or 2009. Annie is my wife, and she's worked closely with you. She ended up being the chair of the Maine Grain Alliance for 2-3-year terms, so 6 years. Do I have that right?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Chair of the board.
Yeah, so this is fun for me also because I've heard about a lot of this stuff sort of like secondhand because Annie was so involved in it. But this is my chance to pick your brain and find out all the details, which I know the outline of. And so the story, though, that I want to tell you, in a way, has to do with why we're here in Cornville, I feel like, because I think it was 2008 or 2009, we were working on a farm, horsepower farm, with the lovely Birdsall family out in Blue Hill, Maine, so on the coast of Maine. And at that point, we had started a farm in Pennsylvania that didn't work out due to land access issues. And so we were looking to relocate. And we heard about the Kneading Conference. We applied for scholarships. I'm probably 2009-ish. And we got scholarships to the Kneading Conference. And so, but we were apprenticing on this farm, didn't have a ton of money. We're trying to save our money, right, to reestablish our farm too. And so we got these scholarships, and we're like, all right, let's go to the Kneading Conference. So we, got the weekend off from the farm. We just left for Skowhegan with a tent. We didn't have anywhere to stay. So now, as my kids are 11 and 13, like this level of spontaneity is unknown anymore. to us. But I remember that we're just like, throw the tent in the car, going to go to Skowhegan for the weekend, go to the kneading conference. And so we show up in Skowhegan, not really knowing anybody. And I forget if we came like registered for the conference and we're like, hey, we're in town and need somewhere to pitch our tent.
Yep.
And somebody was like, Albie Barden, go contact Albie Barden. He'll let you camp on his yard. Yeah, I'm sure. And so we got a hold of Albie, who is, I don't even know. He's one of the other people who's very involved in the kneading conference. And so sure enough, we contacted Albie, and he said, yeah, sure. Put your tent on my front yard. And so we ended up camping out on Albie's yard during the duration of that kneading conference. And now we're, of course, and are dear friends with his whole family. So we went to the kneading conference, and for us, that kind of put Skowhegan on the map, local foods wise, because we had all this farm equipment because we had already started a farm, and we were looking for somewhere to restart. And so we knew about the kneading conference. We knew that there was a farmer's market here, and it seems like there's some other stuff that I'm forgetting about. But basically, it seems like Skowhegan was kind of like punching above its weight. Like for a town of roughly 10,000 people, we were like, wow, there's a surprising amount going on here. And I forget, the mill may have been one of those other things, because I don't know where you were at with the mill by that point, and I think you'll tell us in a minute.
Yeah.
But, we were like, wow, like for a town of 10,000, there's a lot going on. And so here we are, 15 years later, we've been here for almost, around 15 years at this point. So that's just a fun story of us. Although, so as long as we're talking about the kneading conference, can you tell us a little bit about the kneading conference? Because that's a really cool thing. Pretty unique I don't know of other conferences that do what the kneading conference does, except for the kneading conference West. So I want to prompt you that after, seeing how great the kneading conference was here on the East Coast, right? There's now a kneading conference West, which I don't know if it's still going, but tell us about the kneading conference.
Okay, that's such a great story, Andrew. And I certainly know that the kneading conference was part of what brought you here, and we're so glad about that. And I think, it's sometimes unique, quirky, out of the way, off the beaten path events that open our eyes to new things. And so we're so pleased when people come all this way to Skowhegan to discover themes they care about. So the kneading conference is an annual gathering of farmers, millers, bakers, researchers, brewers, anyone who cares about grain and finds themselves in the grain economy in some way. And that might be people who just enjoy baking at home and want to learn more. It might be professionals that are running their own businesses, bakeries or grain businesses, breweries. It could also be teachers and instructors in universities. We mix all these folks together for 2 intensive days of workshops on grain-related topics. And then it all culminates in a bread fair that is celebratory in nature on the 3rd day. And we invite bread vendors and crafters and folks to come to the Skowhegan State Fairgrounds and enjoy all the themes that we've been talking about. So it is a unique event. And I think one of the most unique things about it is that it's pretty rare to have an amateur home baker be able to rub elbows with Jeffrey Hamelman or Richard Miskovich or professionals at the top of their game and have access to them for everyday questions about grain and bread baking. So our attendees love it. Our presenters love it. It's a chance to kind of take off their tall white hats and their white chef's coats and relax a bit in a casual environment and teach and geek out on all things grain. So that first conference in 2007 really kicked off an exciting trend, and we've been so fortunate to be able to host the event annually ever since. We had a 1 year in COVID of having it be a virtual conference, but we still did it, and we still get together in person, and it's really wonderful. Many folks in the professional bread communities doubted that there was that much interest to be able to host an event like this annually, and we've been able to prove them wrong. There was a nice long run of a kneading conference West. It is no longer happening, but we, at the invitation of folks in Washington State University, we did help them get a conference off the ground out there that they named Kneading Conference West. They also received charitable contributions to build a bread lab that is still supported by King Arthur Flour and others out there to do kind of intensive study and research on different varietals of grains and how they translate for bread baking. So lots has happened out there as well. And I would say Since the Kneading Conference began in 2007, there is just a whole host of activities around the world happening, nonprofits forming to try to create some of the same kinds of impact around their local grain economies. We are networked with those kinds of groups around the world now. We attend their conferences. They attend ours. There's an incredible amount of global sharing now around this theme of reviving small-scale regional grain economies.
Yeah. It's a really great event, and it's a, just a cool idea to bring together all those people, the grain growers, the bakers, the oven builders, like you said, brewers, and all these other people. It's because I think conferences tend to be like farmers or bakers or something like that. And it makes me realize how all those communities have a stake in, making this thing go. So yes, is Kneading conferences every year?
Yep, it's every year, and we always schedule it for the final Thursday, Friday of July. Here in Maine, when the weather is beautiful, there is grain to see in the fields. On our test plots here, we know that can be a difficult time for bakers and farmers to get away. And so we do our best. We also host year-round workshops for those that can't make it here in July. But it's a lovely time to visit Maine. It's a great time to have a bread fair outside. So mark your calendars. That's the formula.
Yeah. Yeah. People, come check it out if you can. If you're interested in July, it is a fun event in beautiful Skowhegan. And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or vegetables for your family, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment for a harvest you can count on. Rimmel greenhouses are strong, durable, and easy to assemble, offering the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Rimmel greenhouses are proudly built right here in America and shipped to anywhere in the U.S. With technical sales staff members located across the country, many with growing experience, the Rimmel Greenhouses team of experts will serve as your trusted partner every step of the way to ensure that you get exceptional value from your greenhouse investment. Visit Rimmel.com to get a quote today. Local Line is the most popular software platform for farmers and food hubs selling direct to consumer. With features like e-commerce, inventory management, subscriptions, and box builder, Local Line helps you grow sales, save time, and streamline your operations. In fact, last year, farms that used Local Line grew their sales by 23%. Ready to switch to a proven sales software that does it all? Local Line has no setup fees, no commissions, and will migrate your storefront for free, so you'll be up and running in no time. As a GFM podcast listener, Local Line is offering a free premium feature for 1 year with your subscription using the coupon code GFM2025. Don't wait. Start your season off the right way with Local Line. And now, back to the show. So when did you end up starting the mill?
So I mentioned 2007 conference, we realized what the problem was in Maine. I mentioned that Michael Scholes and I started looking at other mills in 2008 and 9. And it was that time period that we realized there's no one out there, really. There's no business out there to come to Skowhegan and solve this problem for Maine. Industrial mills are sized such that they mill as much in a day as our first year milling projections would be. So we would mill as much in a year as an industrial mill mills in a day. The scale is just incomparable. So we set out to build a business plan. We formed Maine Grains in 2008. It took several years of business planning and fundraising and identifying where to do it, and that we would buy this building for the mill. I went out to a course at Kansas State University to have a crash course in milling and understand some key parameters in the industry. And so ultimately we bought this old jail building in 2009 because it was going to be vacated of inmates. It's a 14,000 square foot, 4-story concrete cinder block brick Victorian jailhouse that needed a new life. We knew that it could be purchased for not cheap, but something highly affordable because it's kind of a white elephant building in a center of our downtown. We had learned that vertical height in milling is super beneficial. You can send grain to the top of a facility and gravity feed through machines on the way down. And yet vertical height in a new building is much more expensive to build. So the course I had taken out in Kansas led me to invite the instructor of the course from Kansas out here to take a look at the building and be our earliest consultant in how we would renovate this 4-story jail into a grain mill. Ironically, when you think of jails and thick walls that are impenetrable, that also makes for a soundproof building where the noise we make inside can't be heard on the street. It makes for a rodent-proof building. It makes for a building that's easy to clean. It was difficult and expensive to renovate. So we spent, as I said, several years figuring out how to afford all the drilling and concrete cutting that was necessary to install machines and grain bins in and outside the facility, and ultimately launched Maine Grains in 2012, in September of 2012.
Okay. And it's such a great project. Can we come down and get a tour sometime?
Absolutely. I'd love to have you come down and have a tour.
Okay, because that's something I feel like it's hard to imagine, the project, right? Because wasn't it Civil War era? Like, wasn't the building built in 1863 or something like that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And so, picture, it's our little town of 10,000 people right in the center of town. There's this 130, and by now it's more like 160. It's more closer to 160-year-old jail building. So when we first moved to Skowhegan, there's barbed wire around it right in the middle of town. And so just like most municipalities do, they built a new jail, a new county jail, because Skowhegan is the county seat of our county, Somerset County, Maine. So they built a not 150-year-old prison for the county jail. So then there's this building in town that's barbed wire and all this kind of stuff. And it's just such an improvement. I mean, not only have a thriving business that supports, local foods and a local economy, but, go from barbed wire to, like you said, you have the silos on the outside. Like, it's very clear what it is. It's, it's basically a cool thing to have downtown instead of sort of like you said, I don't know what to call it, a white elephant.
Yeah.
It's hard to picture. So that's why I was thinking, like, we might even be able to come down and do a video tour and get that out around the time this podcast comes out, because this is one of these things I feel like you can tell people about it, but it's hard to picture unless you actually see it.
Yeah, I can give you some before and after shots. It was certainly a foreboding building. And as you said, 14-foot barbed wire fences all around the perimeter of the building. When I first started looking at the building, it was still full of inmates. And I used to have to take tours to make decisions about whether or not we wanted to buy the building with the deputy who would get us in and through all the locked doors and whatnot. Very monochromatic gray on the inside. And it was a 2-year process to convince the county commissioners to sell us the building. We were first-time business owners. The idea was creative and out of the box, but also high risk from their perspective. There had been some other failures in town around giving decommissioned municipal buildings to developers to develop and not having them do what they said they would do. So we were on the heels of some sad stories. And so there was understandable concern about whether or not to sell it to us. So that took about 2 years. We were ultimately successful buying this 14,000 square foot building with a fully functional commercial kitchen for $65,000. And then we set out to raise about $3 million to renovate the building and buy equipment and get the business off the ground. So as you said, it can't be underestimated what an eyesore it was and how desperately the people of Skowhegan wanted something hopeful and vibrant to happen here and in the downtown. It should be mentioned that we are a designated Main Street community. And so at that time, we were already kind of coalescing around a common set of goals and vision for the town to remake itself in the wake of the loss of shoe factories and woolen mills and wood products industries that last saw this community vibrant and its people employed. So this is a town that has suffered some hard times due to the loss of manufacturing and industry here. And so we desperately want a way forward and a way toward the future. Main Street really identified that this is still an area where farmland is affordable. Farming is still a way of life. Being in the woods is still a way of life. We are rich in natural resources here in central Maine. And so economic opportunities that are built around the stewardship of natural resources is still a smart way to look at job creation here. So I know we're going to get into a conversation about nonprofits and for-profits, but this is an important thing to understand because the stewardship of natural resources, job creation, alleviating generational poverty and the hunger that goes with it, and alleviating slum and blight, which is what this block that we're in had been designated at the time that I bought this building. Those all have a shade of charitable mission, right? If you wanted to start a grain business and be as profitable as possible selling grain, you might not do that here. And so, but for partnerships with fiscal sponsors and nonprofits, but for the charitable support of philanthropists and grants, this might not have happened here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's good to know. So, blight, what did you say? Slum and blight is an actual designation for.
That is a designation that must be declared by your town body. So, at our town meeting, we had to approve the declaration of this block as a slum and blight area in order to access federal funds to help with its improvement. And so, at the time, we had an empty jail. We had an empty hotel building right next to us that was falling apart. We had lots of infrastructure in the downtown without resources to care for it.
Okay. I don't know about any of this stuff, so this is very interesting. This is all new to me. And I want to point out, too, that there are real concrete ways for the community to engage with the mill, right? Because you've got a restaurant downstairs called the Miller's Table, which is lovely. If people are in Skowhegan, they should go have a meal. It's local foods, locally, the baked products are milled upstairs. And you've also got a dry goods store, right, where people can buy the flour and all kinds of related accoutrements, right?
Yep.
So there's that. It's not just there. People can go in and engage. And actually, I just read an article in the paper the other day about how you're building another building or something like that. Can you tell us about your future project that looks like it's coming down the road?
Yes, we are still expanding and growing, and as you said, Andrew, like executing this business plan idea here in the center of town has exceeded my wildest vision for the impact that we would have on town. We were able several years later to launch a bakery and cafe out of the building to repurpose the commercial kitchen that was here. We were able to pretty immediately welcome our farmers market onto our property at no charge because it offered enough space for the growing market. We've been able to rent spaces out in this building that are not needed by Maine Grains that utilize other aspects of the building. So we have a radio station in the building that uses the old ham radio tower on the roof. We have a knit shop that was started by another group of community entrepreneurs. We have a creamery that's making fresh ricotta and aged cheeses right here on site. So we've been able to use the resources of the building in lots of creative ways. We've also, found ourselves to be a producer of a core ingredient that is needed by other entrepreneurs value adding into products in their startup businesses. So we have been able to incubate a pizza dough company out of our kitchen that successfully launched and built a building 8 miles up the road to manufacture pizza dough that is made with our grains. We work closely with an ice cream sandwich maker that uses our grains in the cookie, with cracker makers and pasta makers, and even people taking our byproducts and turning them into compost and food for mealyworm growth and cat litter, you name it. There are entrepreneurs out there trying to make good, profitable use of all aspects of what we're doing here. So that's been really, really fun to see. And we are still growing. When that dilapidated hotel building next door to us was finally torn down by the town as a safety and kind of environmental cleanup problem, they put the land back up for sale. We bought the land in order to have that space for future expansion, which is now. And we've been working several years on trying to design and build a right-sized building for our growth. And what that will look like is a large building that covers a piece of that now vacant lot that houses an equipment line from Germany to make extruded, ready-to-eat products. So think ready-to-eat, high-fiber, high-protein cereals made from local grains, bars, puff snacks, even co-manufactured products that help other businesses in Maine manufacture their core ingredients. So one of the things that I think is most fun to imagine, aside from cereal, is there's a chocolatier in Maine that has lost his producer of malted milk ball centers to be able to coat the malted milk balls in chocolate and sell them as a confection. Well, guess what malted milk balls are made of? But malted barley. I mean, the day that malted milk balls in Maine become part of the local grain economy is going to be a very fun day. But they are. And so this extrusion equipment could allow us to support companies like that in making and building the ingredients that they need for their core ingredients, and further support the farmers of Maine in what they're doing. So yes, new building is coming for equipment, for an expanded dry goods shop, for a demonstration kitchen that will allow us to teach and do more classes. We'll have a large social hall in that building, which allows us to host the farmers market in the wintertime and keep them right here on the campus when cold temperatures arrive. It will allow us to host workshops during the kneading conference in a more well-suited kitchen and educational space. So we're very excited about that. It's a huge hurdle to try to get new construction built in a rural area like Skowhegan. The biggest obstacle is that any construction you do here in a rural area is going to cost about 3 times as much as the building will appraise at as soon as it's built. So imagine a building is going to cost $6 million to build and outfit. The day it's built, it will appraise at $2 million. And that is because of decades of disinvestment in areas like this, where new construction has largely been chain stores, box stores, low value construction. And there just are not comparable projects in a nearby radius to warrant a higher appraisal. So it is commonly thought that it will take decades of pioneering projects to change that equation in areas like ours. So this is another reason why for-profit, not-for-profit partnerships are so critical to make forward progress happen. It's very hard on a for-profit basis alone to fill these kinds of gaps for business growth.
Okay. And did I read that the farmers market is going to go in the building in the wintertime or something like that?
Yes, we are reserving a nice big social hall in the new building so that the farmers market can tuck in there in the wintertime and even in the summer if there are farmers with delicate vegetables or who would prefer to be in a shady space. The social hall could be available then too. The new building and this existing building will form a nice big plaza where the market meets currently in the summertime, but we'll finally have some permanent infrastructure for the market to do its credit card and EBT processing, and for shelter, seasonal shelter.
That's so amazing. I'm so glad you're doing all this stuff, Amber. That's why I'm glad we're talking about it. Because the mill by itself, but especially this expanded vision, I feel like is just a linchpin. You know, it's like, you know how they used to talk about malls of having like an anchor store of Macy's or something like that? Mm-hmm. To use a really bad analogy, I feel like the Maine Grains, and what you're doing is kind of like an anchor for local foods in downtown, right? Because that's, I wanted to point out about the housing the farmers market, because that's a detail that I think our audience is going to love, because I know, for years. So right now, I think you mentioned this, but just to reiterate, the farmers market is in the parking lot of your mill right now. And so for years, the farmers market has kind of bounced around in the wintertime. I remember back when we were doing the farmers market, we stopped in the pandemic year of 2020, but when we were doing the farmers market, some years we were outdoors all winter long.
Yeah.
And I mean, I probably don't need to explain to people, there are some brutal cold market days. I mean, I guess it's great if you're a meat vendor and your meat stays frozen, but right now it's January. We're having negative temperatures overnight, single degree Fahrenheit temperatures during the day. It's going to be so great for the vendors and just the traffic, right? Because even like there's some dedicated people who will come out to a farmer's market when it's in the teens, but it's discouraging. Yeah, so that's great.
You don't need frostbite on your butternut squash and your onions and your garlic.
Yeah, exactly. I seem to remember bringing stuff in coolers to keep it from freezing.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And so this is why we need to do a tour, get some pictures, because I think the amazingness of this project is hard to convey.
Yeah.
So I guess we're at the point, this is making me wonder. So Maine Grains is for-profit. The Maine Grain Alliance is non-profit. And you were just telling me about how you had to raise $3 million to do the original renovations on the mill. And I know there was another big fundraising to do this next phase of the project. And I'm just assuming that's probably something that either you at Maine Grains or that the Maine Grain Alliance is doing on a regular basis, is finding grants to support the projects, right? You probably got a list of projects. Obviously you do. You're about to embark on this next phase of the mill, right? And so let's say like that initial $3 million to get the mill renovated to the point where it could be a functioning mill. Did Maine Grain Alliance, the nonprofit part of this whole equation, help raise the money to get Maine Grains going? Or was that the kind of thing where you raised funds through Maine Grains, the for-profit part?
Yep, I'm happy to walk you through it. So raising the money to get the mill off the ground and the building renovated was a mix of every kind of financing you could imagine. It was traditional bank loans, it was grants, it was peer-to-peer loans from family, etc. The quandary we found ourselves in is that most banks are only going to loan against the collateral value of your building and your equipment. So because we had purchased this building for $65,000, we were only able to get a loan for $65,000 from a local bank. So a lot of our early grant writing for this project, we partnered with our economic development agencies in Skowhegan. The Maine Grain Alliance was still a fledgling nonprofit. I was involved in the Maine Grain Alliance at that time, so I didn't want there to be a conflict of interest by working with that nonprofit entity to get this off the ground. But I'll explain other ways that the Maine Grain Alliance has been helpful to this project. But I went to economic development agencies here in my town and I said, hey, we're going to be alleviating slum and blight. We're going to be creating jobs. We are going to host the farmers market, which runs a successful SNAP and EBT matching program, extending the value of a purchase to buy more fruits and vegetables. We are solving the social problems of this community that you exist to help solve. And we laid the groundwork in some resolves, writing some resolves, and which are essentially just legal documents that justify why would an economic development agency write grants together with us and allow them to flow through to for-profit companies to solve social problems. We wrote that up formally. We got the help of lawyers to help do that, and we researched the precedent in the law that would allow a philanthropic organization or a charitable donor to give monies to the economic development agency, the nonprofit, at a tax deduction, which would then flow through to for-profit entities. In some cases, that wasn't just Maine Grains. In some cases, we sought grants from charitable foundations to improve infrastructure on farm and food processing sites. So we would get a $250,000 grant at the Economic Development Agency that would be dispersed through a fair and equitable decision-making process to lots of different for-profit companies in Skowhegan that were working towards the same things. But infrastructure and processing might look like pasteurization of cider at the apple farm. It might look like a cold storage facility on someone's farm. It might look like grain bins here at the mill. So a nonprofit needs to be careful that they are steering clear of, the term is private inurement. You can't form a nonprofit just to funnel it back to yourself. So you have to avoid conflicts of interest. You have to keep an arm's length distance between the transactions. So a nonprofit board is going to have ultimate control over grant monies that they can spend to exercise their mission and vision. But what you'll find is that a lot of times a for-profit company and a nonprofit have a shared mission and vision if you are a socially minded company. So back to your original question, we never used the Maine Grain Alliance in that capacity due to wanting there to be a clear arm's length transaction, but there were plenty of other nonprofits that we could work with. The benefit of having the Maine Grain Alliance doing its education and outreach and capacity building statewide while we were building a business to serve in the community is just that they were helping bolster the strength of the entire state grain economy at the same time that we were preparing to buy grain from farms, and we needed it to be dry enough to bring it into the facility, clean enough to bring into the facility, A lot of farms didn't have grain bins or dryers or the know-how yet to protect the quality of the grain. And so really that's the role the Maine Grain Alliance played and still continues to play, is helping to solve those pinch points in the entire grain economy.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other point I just wanted to make is the tax laws have changed a little bit, and they are changing the landscape of how we partner in the private and public sector. So up until 2018, a pass-through grant made at the discretion of a nonprofit was not taxable to the for-profit receiving the grant, because there was a shared charitable purpose or a shared mission related purpose. In 2018, under the first Trump presidency, that was changed so that now if grant monies flow through a fiscal sponsor or a nonprofit to a for-profit company, any monies coming in that create the term is business benefit is taxable no matter what. That is creating some hardship for the receipt of grants. That said, grants are still free money, but now we have to pay tax on them, whether we receive them directly or whether we receive them indirectly through a nonprofit. So even this past year, I've been spending down a USDA Healthy Food Financing Initiative grant to help prepare the lot and the building and the market space for more positive contributions to local food purchasing for low-income families here in Skowhegan. That's still all taxable because it's flowing through a private business. I am investigating new ways to structure these kinds of arrangements to see what we can do about that. I don't expect it to change under this Trump presidency, but it may speak to the benefit of more of our charitably minded projects to think about just forming nonprofits or doing that work through the formation of a foundation that funds their work. There's work to do to keep looking at the legal structures there to make sure that charitable monies that are intended to do good work, you're not turning over about 30% of that back to the government.
Right. I mean, to me, it makes sense to make all the money go to what it's supposed to do. But
yeah,
I guess that's the reality, is that these things are always changing. In fact, we had an author for the magazine who was going to write an article about getting grants for farm projects because she's been very involved in that on her farm. She's gotten a lot of grants in. We decided to put that off for a year so she could, because she's still in the mix of doing all that. And so she actually asked us to postpone it for a year to be able to report back if and what has changed under the new administration.
Yeah.
So, and I want to ask one follow-up question to all that. Are you saying that you had to pay tax on that because the money was going from Maine Grain Alliance, the nonprofit, over to Maine Grains, or is it because it was the grant was funded straight to Maine Grains, the for-profit, and it just gets taxed?
The answer is both. So since 2018, if an economic development agency receives grant funds on behalf of a project our for-profit companies are working on, and we receive those monies, even if the economic development agency makes the purchase, cuts the check directly to a vendor, and it doesn't ever flow through our account, it still creates business benefit that is taxable to the for-profit company.
Okay.
Now, there are cases where there will be state and federal grants that can go directly to a for-profit company. And the most recent example in Maine would be the Ag Infrastructure Investment Program. That was part of the infrastructure improvement post-COVID monies that came through to states. The state of Maine did a lot of investment in agriculture as part of that time period. Those grants that came directly to the mill, to Maine Grains, to creameries, breweries, you name it, those are taxable as well.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, good to know. So I guess this is a two-part question. I'm not wrong to say that Maine Grains and the Maine Grain Alliance, I mean, they obviously work together. I mean, it sounds like, I know that Maine Grain Alliance does other things, just supports other, like you were just saying, the whole job of Maine Grain Alliance is not to work with Maine Grains. Like you said, Maine Grain Alliance is supposed to help grains in the state, including the for-profit Maine Grains, but also other farms and organizations to, like you were saying, build out that infrastructure so that grain can go from being grown to being milled right here in the state. But so first of all, I want to make sure I'm not mischaracterizing that relationship. And the second part of my question is this a common thing? Because I don't really know anything about nonprofits or this kind of thing. So, and I was thinking about, I guess, I was partially thinking about my own project and thinking about your project and thinking like, wow, that's an interesting thing. Is it a common thing to have for-profit, nonprofit partnerships, or is this something you thought of?
I think there's a lot of ways to think about this. Let me address the first question first. As I mentioned, because I'm involved in both, I'm careful to maintain arm's length relationships with the Maine Grain Alliance. But the Alliance, the nonprofit, exists to host the kneading conference, the bread fair, year-round baking workshops that are hosted virtually and in person. It raises funds from banks and donors to give out technical assistance grants to grain-based businesses across the state of Maine to help them build capacity. It operates under a government grant right now to help encourage more organic grain production in the state. So those are its educational and charitable missions. A lot of that work is beyond my ability as a miller to be involved in. So the mill, a for-profit entity, we actually donate a portion of proceeds from our dry goods shop to the Alliance to help fuel all that work, because it is beneficial. If we can have more organic grain growers in the state, then I have more grain to be able to buy and add value to and support the entrepreneurs and bakers and brewers downstream from us. So we actually provide charitable contributions to the Maine Grain Alliance to help support that work. So in that sense, yes, we work collaboratively, but the Alliance does not exist just to support us. They exist to support the revival of grain economies everywhere, right? So is it common for public-private partnerships? I think from if you call it triple bottom line or a mission aligned point of view, if you are a business that is trying to support people, profits, and planet, there are things that you just need to do because they're the right thing to do and they don't make you money. So that may be the charitable part of what some of our businesses want to do. That said, people use their charitable and social missions for marketing purposes now. There are companies that donate a portion of proceeds to, for example, 1% for the planet. It's a way to say, hey, come buy our food because we do good things with your money that are beyond just lining our pockets, right? So a social mission can be good marketing. It can be a way of aligning with your customer. You're also seeing more companies these days, even, big corporations, form foundations. Even Boeing might be an example, or insurance companies have an example where you have Harvard Pilgrim, for example, was one of the first donors to some of our farmers market work to support low-income families. Well, that was because they had a healthcare foundation. Where does that money come from? Well, that money could come from the corporation itself. You could funnel money from the for-profit entity into the foundation to give it away and do good work. That becomes an expense in your organization that draws down your taxable profits in your company and allows you to do good work. Right? So it can be very strategic too. A foundation could be a vehicle just to get monies out into the causes you care about. So I think there's a whole mix of structures, and I like being a collector of these models. Like, oh, interesting. How is that working? Why are they doing that? How does that benefit? And again, arm's length transactions. You cannot form a foundation just to route money back to yourself, but you can have a foundation that does good things in the community. I'll give you an example of something we're considering here at Maine Grains. We just by choice decided that we would give 5% of the proceeds of our dry goods shop to the Maine Grain Alliance to keep in recognition that we wouldn't exist if it weren't for the founding energies of the founders of the Maine Grain Alliance, who came together around a dining room table and said, we'll volunteer our time to start conversations between farmers and millers and bakers, right? That took a lot of skin in the game and continues to run on the backs of volunteers who give of themselves. So we want to fuel that good work. It helps all of us. We also give 5% of proceeds from Liberation Farms cornmeal products. We give 5% back to the Somali Bantu immigrant farm where that's grown so that they can build capacity on the farm. It's part of the right thing to do to build more capacity, right? We're not routing that through a foundation right now. We could, if we had a Maine Grains Foundation, we could take those proceeds that we're giving away anyway, and we could ask other donors to match them. We could go to a philanthropic foundation and say, we're going to give 5% if you'll match that 1-for-1 or, 2-to-1 and raise more. We could do more good work that way. So, again, there's some just legal and strategic reasons that companies might want to consider public-private entities and partnerships.
Okay, well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of my questions was going to be about the rules of how nonprofits and for-profits can work together. So, can I tell you about my project and see if if you think it even makes sense for this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So about a decade ago, as you know, I was working in the research department at Johnny Selected Seeds, which is about 45 minutes down the road from where we are here in Skowhegan. Maybe not even that. And working on my farm, nights and weekends. And I was planning this greenhouse project just because that's my passion. And I thought of it as the green greenhouse. So my idea was that I wanted to build an actual production greenhouse that would be part of our farm, larger than any of our greenhouses, like, I don't know, a third of an acre, half acre, something like that. And the idea was that would bump up the production on our farm and allow us to access wholesale markets at like grocery stores and things like that. But also, I love greenhouse growing. My biggest problem with it is it is resource intensive. It you burn a lot of fuel, a lot of plastic goes into covering a lot of the houses and a lot of the, tools inside and things like that. And so to my mind, I feel like a lot of the exciting progress that's being made in the greenhouse growing field is in just making things more efficient, making them less resource intensive and things like that, right? So I feel like this is the way that it's going. But I wanted to try some semi-experimental technologies. And so I'm saying semi-experimental because I'll name a couple of them, and some people may be like, oh, I already have that. I know people are doing some of these, but I also know that banks are hesitant to loan money for unproven technologies. And so I'm talking things like using geothermal heat and other essentially carbon neutral heating sources and integrating solar. And you can imagine there's all kinds of technology that is coming viable for actual commercial greenhouse production, but it's not widely used or mostly used in big greenhouses or something like that. So basically, I've got this spreadsheet still on my computer from a decade ago called the Green Greenhouse. And, I got to the point where I actually quoted out a greenhouse frame. I got quotes on a geothermal system. Like I was taking all the steps to make this project happen when I got approached about doing the magazine. Mm-hmm. It's because I was writing for the magazine. And so I took the magazine just because the Growing for Market was really helpful for Annie and me when we were learning farming. And also because the magazine was a once in a lifetime opportunity. Lynn Basinski, who some of our audience may know because she edited the magazine for 23 years. And she also wrote the book, The Flower Farmer, and a couple other books that our audience may be familiar with this. I think she was just ready to hand it off to somebody else. And I had been writing for the magazine. And so she asked me, and I basically put my greenhouse project on long-term hold because I knew if I said no to the magazine, it was an opportunity that would never come again. Mm-hmm. So now I'm almost a decade into running the magazine. I think this is the beginning of my 9th year running the magazine. But I've never forgotten about this greenhouse project. I still want to do it. And when I was originally conceiving of it, I wanted it to be a part of our production farm. And part of my idea was to generate real world production numbers that I could share with other farmers because people always want to know, understandably, what their payback time is. If I spend $100,000 on a geothermal system, how many years is it going to take me to save $100,000 in propane costs, let's say? And so, we've done we thought it was about 5 years. We've talked to other people who have these systems. We did our own calculations, but there's nothing like actually doing it in the real world. There's one thing to say, we think it's going to take 5 years to pay off a $100,000 geothermal system. It's a whole other thing to do it and be like, look, we paid off our geothermal system in 5 years and now it's all gravy. Mm-hmm. Now we make money on all the heat that we save.
Yep.
So in the back of my head, I still got this idea about this greenhouse project going. And the more I think about it, partially I was thinking about what you were doing at the mill, and I was also thinking about how there was definitely some risk involved in that we are trying to use newer technologies, because I actually got to the point where I was starting to talk to some sort of like angel investors and, like people who wanted to make a green greenhouse project happen, but they also weren't just like, here's the money, go do it. There would be liability. And we got into all these scenarios of like, we might have to break the land that the greenhouse is on off as a separate part from the farm so that if the project failed, we didn't lose the whole farm. And like, all these things that not having done a project like this before, I hadn't thought of.
Yeah.
So now we're a decade in and I'm fine. I'm like, I still want to do this project and I might even have the time to do it. So, but now I'm thinking, okay, you want to use experimental energy and experimental methods to run this greenhouse. Maybe that's actually a better project to do as a nonprofit. That way, if it doesn't work out, we don't go out of business, or lose the greenhouse and the land that's on, or those kinds of things. And furthermore, I realized that doing it as a nonprofit would actually allow us to be even more experimental as far as trying, crops that people aren't sure if they will pay off in a greenhouse, trying more speculative technology, like newer cutting edge technology that really hasn't been proven. So I'm glad that I took over the magazine. I'm also glad that I haven't done the project because I think it might actually do better as a nonprofit. So my idea was where the nonprofit aspect of it is that we build the greenhouse with two, I think at least two good purposes in mind. The first one is to run a real world production greenhouse with these experimental technologies, share all the numbers, because that's something that's hard to find. And you can imagine some farmers are very sharing of their numbers, some are not. And so if you want to know of like, oh, I want to grow, greenhouse beefsteak tomatoes in this particular production scenario, it's hard to find out what kind of production can I actually expect from this scenario because that information just isn't public. And so the first good thing that I could see coming out of this project would be the idea is that we share the numbers from everything that we do. So if people want to know of like, oh, how much did your geothermal system cost? How many BTUs did it actually generate, saving you, X amount of dollars? What's the payback time? You basically will share everything. So if anybody has questions, there you go. And obviously the whole idea is that we're trying to encourage people to do this, right? Because, greenhouse growing just needs to get more efficient. And so the thing about running a project like that is that to generate the data, we're going to be making produce, right? We got to grow the stuff. And, my idea for people to take it seriously as an analogy to their own production farm, we've got to run it very much like a production farm. Otherwise, people are going to be like, oh, you only did tiny sizes, or you don't have to meet the demands of an actual production farm or something like that. So by nature, we're going to be generating produce and other farm products, right? And so the second good thing I think would come out of this is this is not a rich area that we live in. There's, I don't know if you call it food insecurity, hunger, or whatever. There's definitely, we are not a rich area of a not rich state. And so my idea was to take all the produce that's essentially our experiments, our trials. We have to grow crops, tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that. We have to grow them to be able to generate the data that we need to share with people. So what are we doing with all that? So I'm like, okay, we could donate produce to, I'm sure if we had produce to donate, we'd find it. Food banks, I'm thinking like school snack programs, right? Because I know, like, my kids go to the schools around here. I know they give them some things that are really great, like prepackaged carrots probably from California or somewhere. And then they also get some junk food in the snacks. And it's obviously better than starving. But I'm like, hey, what if we could put snack cucumbers into the schools around here or something like this? So that's my idea. I feel like there's a strong case that there's a public interest, or like basically we would be doing something good and also something that would be harder to do as a for-profit business. And so I don't know if it's a public for-profit nonprofit partnership, in as much that I guess the for-profit business that I have is growing for market. And that would be, I guess I see the magazine and the podcast and all social media, all our channels would be ways to disseminate this information, both tell people that we have this project, share the information of it. And presumably there's other organizations in this space that we could share it through. But it's a ready-made, growing for market is a ready-made way to transmit this information to people. I think the greenhouse itself, if I could do it, would be a nonprofit, right? Because the whole idea is that we're doing these experimental things to generate data to help grow the green agriculture space. And then we're donating the products of our labors, whether that's the information or the produce itself. So does that seem like, from what like you were saying, that you need to be the rules of engagement for-profits, nonprofit? Does that make sense as a project like that? And also with other farmers may have similar things, other projects they might want to do that don't make sense for their farms as a financial perspective.
Yeah. I could see this from a couple different angles. Well, first, I'll say that, if you were to remain a for-profit farm who's trying to use green technologies to prove a new and more efficient way of greenhouse growing, there are sometimes funders in the state of Maine, like Maine Technology Institute or USDA's programs in rural business energy and business improvement. There are programs like that that will give grants to for-profit companies to make innovative leaps, to prove out efficiency improvements, to make your business more viable. So you could pursue some of those monies. If what you need is a one-time infusion to get the infrastructure built, then you're pretty confident that what you do in the enterprise will be self-sustaining, right? If the work of building an innovative greenhouse and trialing new crops that are not yet proven in that greenhouse environment really has a long runtime to figure out its viability, then maybe there is an argument for it being a nonprofit. In that case, you will have a board of directors that govern the control of the nonprofit and any revenues. I think one of the common misnomers is that a nonprofit organization doesn't need to be profitable. I mean, if you're going to survive, you need to figure out how to cover your operations, which includes hiring people to do the work of the nonprofit, or paying for marketing, or paying for the seeds and things you need, that sort of thing. So a nonprofit, I like to think of it as really the reason why you're applying to the IRS for nonprofit status is that you are making the case that you have a social contract in the work you're doing, that you're going to make the world and people's lives better in some way that honestly reduces the tax burden for our country, right? So if you think about it that way, what does the greenhouse do to improve, in a social contract, improve the lot in life and the education we have as human beings and farmers, and make the world a better place? And you've outlined some of those things. If your greenhouse model is intended to be replicable by for-profit farmers, you'll need to make a case that over time you are figuring that out so that it is a viable solution for other farmers, because the solution probably isn't having all other greenhouse farmers become nonprofits, right? So you outlined some things like, we're going to see if energy efficiency works. We're going to see how many years it takes to pay off. We're going to identify the crops that do well in this greenhouse environment. I think it's okay to say, we've got to figure out how this operation becomes viable, even if we have a charitable mission to give away excess produce to pantries. We're going to try to sell what comes out of this greenhouse so that we can buy seeds again next year. And this work doesn't, no one will do this work for free. So we're going to figure out how this project generates revenue to pay its operator, a farmer operator. We're going to figure out how to pay for the marketing and dissemination of information to other farmers that might want to try this technology. All of that is an educational mission. It is higher risk taking, and it may have baked in social components, proving out a new and innovative business model. That would be my take. So I think there's ways to see it both ways, Andrew. I think it could be a nonprofit, and you'd have to, in your application for 501c3 status, really map out what are the educational goals, what are the charitable goals, how does this improve life for people and my community, which I think you could do.
Yeah. So that kind of actually jumps us forward to another question that I wanted to ask. That question was, if I decide this is a good idea, do I go and form a nonprofit? It's 501c3, is that right? Or
yes.
I think is what the status.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to do this. Let's say, let's jump ahead a click. Let's say I've thought about this. So I got some great advice from Amber. I want to do this. I'm thinking I go form a 501c3 nonprofit company and then start trying to raise funds and get grants for it, right? Because it sounds pretty sketchy to be like, I'm totally going to form this nonprofit, right? I mean, you can't really go out and start raising funds for a nonprofit that I'm sure people have done that, but it sounds pretty sketchy, right? So is it like you apply to the IRS, you tell them what great societal things you're going to do. And somebody there at the IRS looks it over and is like, sounds good.
That's right.
Approved, or they're like, this is stupid. You know, this is not a nonprofit. Just go start a business.
Yep, that's right. So this is the stage at which, if you've made up your mind that you want to form a nonprofit, I usually get a lawyer involved. The lawyer doesn't have to do all the work for you. And sometimes you'll find a philanthropic lawyer that cares about your mission and will donate some time. Depends on your connections. But the first step is what's called a 1023 application that you file to the IRS. And that is basically the application that asks you all these questions related to your charitable mission. Why do you want to be a nonprofit? What do you represent? Who will be your representatives? Who are likely to be your first board of directors? Who cares about this work? And then folks at the IRS will review your application and determine whether you meet the criteria for charitable status. And so if that is approved, then you get a letter of designation back that says, congratulations, you've been assigned a 501c3 status, and here's your number. That means you're on a different path for tax filings. You don't form typical tax filings, you form a 990 form for nonprofits and things like that. It means you have to adopt policies on your board of directors that ensure there's no private inurement. So you'll pay attention to conflicts of interest and making sure that you have bylaws that map out how you operate your board of directors and your 501c3, things like that.
Mm-hmm. That brings up another interesting question that I thought about, because, yeah, you know, of course, a business like that is, in a year you're operating, obviously you got expenses from running the greenhouse. So you got labor, you know, ain't going to grow itself. So, you know, in my head, we're donating most of what we do, but yeah, maybe we do need to sell some produce to fund the seed money, labor costs year to year, or something like that. So it's, the idea is not that we can't make money. The idea is not that we can't charge anything for our products. It's just that we can't take the profit over at the end of the year and give it to ourselves.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what separates a nonprofit from a for-profit. It has to go back and, okay.
That's right. The nonprofit can pay its people to do its work. If you think about it, let's say you're going to be a founding member of the nonprofit, but you want to be paid to do the farming work. There needs to be arm's length between those roles. So your board of directors is going to consider, are you the right person for the job? Will you be hired to do this? That might mean that if there is a conflict of interest in the decision making at the board level, that you don't get a vote about some things because you are paid to do some work. It just means being careful about those kinds of boundaries.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, that makes sense. That I'm not like, it's not my own nonprofit. I'm like, we need to give Andrew $100,000 for,
right,
like, whatever he's doing.
Right. But the other thing the nonprofit does allow you is, let's say you attract the attention of philanthropically minded folks that say, hey, that green greenhouse is transforming my community. People are doing this successfully. They're using less plastic. I'm so excited about their mission. I want to be able to give a donation this year to their good work that has tax benefit for me. So if I'm a donor and I want to give you $5,000, I'd like to be able to claim that on my taxes as a charitable donation that is tax deductible. So then you can receive that, and then we both get benefit. Sometimes there are wealthy individuals that really need to bring down want to bring down their own tax burden by giving away enough money to charitable causes, which is their social contract to show the government, look, I'm contributing to the betterment of the welfare of society through my contributions.
Okay, well, I'm so glad that you just explained that to me, because that makes a lot of sense. In that, before, when I was thinking about running it as a for-profit business, yeah, I had made contact with some people like that who wanted to see a ecologically sound greenhouse project happen, but they were, it wasn't, you know, I was basically going to take the money as a loan, and the idea is that the operation of the greenhouse as a commercial concern would pay back the loan. And I can see how that would open up a whole nother set of, there might be some people who wouldn't be interested in that, but there, like you're saying, there might be other people who want to see a greenhouse project happen and want to reduce their tax burden. Because, yeah, I imagine that's where I imagine our funding coming from, like hopefully find some some people who want to see an experimental greenhouse project happen. And I thought also there's companies in this space who might well partner with us. I mean, I'm thinking if you're a company who's developing cutting edge, highly efficient greenhouse technology, we might be able to get a donation of some cutting edge technology because they know that we'll talk about it. The whole, like, we'll put it to action. And so it's, once again, it's beneficial for both, is we could use and try out their technology. And if it's, assuming it's good, then they have a voice saying, hey, we tried this, here are all our numbers, it worked for us, try it yourself. So
yep.
Are there limitations on a nonprofit that people running for-profit businesses won't be used to? And part of the reason I ask that is because I assume a lot of our audience is running businesses. The magazine is published. I'm sure there's some gardeners, and if you're out there listening, we love you. But Growing for Market, the whole 34-year history of Growing for Market, we've had people running market farms, as a business. I'm assuming a lot of people in our audience are already running businesses. That's why I asked it like that.
Mm-hmm. So are there limitations in a nonprofit that folks running for profits might not be used to?
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, I would say the most common thing I see and that I look out for if I'm invited to join a board of directors of a nonprofit is, what are your revenue streams? Where are they coming from? There are some nonprofits that only exist because they raise what they need to exist every year through grants. That's hard work and risky work. What if you don't get the grant? Can you still pay that executive director? Can you still pay that manager? At the Maine Grain Alliance, in our founding years, we felt very strongly that we wanted to have programs that generated income that securely covered our cost of operations, so that grants and grant writing could be used for capacity building steps, new equipment to start a new program, like one-off asks that helped us get going on solving a new pinch point. But we didn't want to be in a position of having to write grants just to stay afloat, keep the lights on, right? So, but there are some organizations that do. So I think that's something to be aware of, is what is the business structure of the nonprofit that keeps the lights on? That's a big one. And I would say the other difference is just understanding, in a nonprofit, you have a board of directors. That means group process. That means no one person gets to make all the decisions unilaterally. There is a lot to know about well-functioning boards and how to make good decisions and how to calendarize the regular activities of a board, like signing your conflict of interest policy or disclosing your conflicts or approving any changes to bylaws or things like that. There's some things to manage relative to fair process. So then, when you're on a nonprofit board, you find yourself reading books about good group process and good governance and the roles and responsibilities of a board member and making sure that those all happen well. That's a different kind of energy. There's organizational dynamic energy in a business too, but that's a different kind of energy for a nonprofit and another set of skills to be aware of.
Okay. Well, that makes sense, to not be in this cycle of like living or dying based on grants. And that's an interesting thing for me to think about, and probably other farmers who might want to do a similar project, because when I originally conceived of the green greenhouse, I had Hannaford. So it should say Hannaford is our local grocery store. And I had Hannaford in mind when I was conceiving of this as a for-profit enterprise of my farm, because I wanted to get into wholesaling, and we needed a bigger greenhouse. Basically, you needed a bigger facility to have production on that level where we could say, I think we could be interesting to Hannaford. And so then I was like, well, if we went nonprofit, maybe we're donating everything. And so now I'm like, I don't know, maybe we would want to sell some to Hannaford to make operating revenue to pay the labor and seeds and all that kind of stuff. And we could, of course, still donate produce, but that's an interesting aspect of it now. One thing I don't want to do is make a nonprofit that competes with the for-profit farms around here.
Right. Yep.
The whole point of Growing for Market and what we're doing is trying to help local farms succeed. So, I definitely don't want to come in and compete with the local farms. On the other hand, I think there's space there. We could either do a different crop, or honestly, like our Hannaford, which I'm sure you probably shop at too, is they have an organic tomato on the shelf 365 days of the year, but it's just in the summertime, they're mostly coming from Canada. In the wintertime, they're coming from Mexico. I'm not saying anything bad about Canada or Mexico. It's just the whole locavore thing is I'm like, why not my tomatoes, you know?
Yeah.
So I also don't feel like there might be space there to sell tomatoes to Hannaford without putting other local farmers out of business. So that's a very interesting aspect. I'm glad.
Yeah. And
that you brought that up.
I think, Andrew, too, there's farm to institution solutions for finding markets for your food that create wholesale opportunities and may also have social impact. So if you go the route of a nonprofit, and I'm thinking specifically of some of the relationships we have with jails who buy our product, and we give them discounted products because they're willing to buy byproducts, if you will, that are still food grade. So, it might be a blend of flours, but they buy it and they make good use of it, and it helps fuel their dining program, and it fuels a baking education program in the jail where inmates reduce their sentence times by contributing in some way. And then money is saved for the taxpayer by making food in-house and not having to buy it. And, there's a cycle of benefit that goes along with some of the farm to institution relationships that are emerging and still growing with hospitals, schools, jails, institutions of the like.
Okay. Are there any curtailments? I don't know how to ask this question. Are there any regulations around selling your produce? I'm thinking like, as long as it's, let's say we started a nonprofit, we put in our submission to the IRS that we want to donate a lot of food, but we also want to sell it where it's not competing with other local growers or something like that. Get approved for nonprofit status, go over to Hannaford, and we're like, we're going to be starting tomato production this year. Do you want to buy them? They just say, is there anything there that a regular someone who's running the for-profit business, again, is it any different at all, or is it just like, as long as it's in your bylaws or whatever they are for your nonprofit, that you can just go to Hannaford and be like, this is a nonprofit business, but we're going to be selling the tomatoes to pay for our labor costs?
Yeah, not to my knowledge. You're probably still under the same requirements if it's GAP certification or food safety planning or things like that. You're still under those same rules and regulations. I think the best example I would give you is the new Harvesting Good broccoli product that's available on the marketplace. That is a product, a saleable product, a business enterprise orchestrated by the Good Shepherd Food Bank, in recognition that there is a byproduct of Maine's broccoli industry that is underutilized. So the Harvesting Good broccoli are the little florets that come behind the main head of broccoli, which is the primary crop. The secondary crop are the little florets. And so Good Shepherd Food Bank said, we have lots of use for this. We don't want to see this product wasted. There's lots of hungry people in Maine. Let's create a business that has a social mission to upcycle and feed families of Maine. And what's interesting is I'd have to look into the legal structure they formed. I can't remember whether it is a nonprofit or an LC3, which is a term for a kind of hybrid LLC, 501c3, kind of a limited profit company. You don't see many of them formed in Maine, but something worth looking into if this is your goal. Even that product, the Harvesting Good florets, the manufacturing and freezing and packaging of them creates a byproduct that is essentially broccoli dust. If you've ever opened a bag of frozen broccoli and all those little teeny little pearls that are left behind, there is now innovation happening in Maine around how to make good use of that, because that's a byproduct of the floret production. And so there's a project down at the Fork Food Lab trying to figure out how to do broccoli tots, combining that with potato and making a little deep fried potato thing that could be served in schools. Again, focusing on local food, focusing on no waste, doing a lot of social good in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I have heard about that project, and that sounds like it could be a good, if I get a little farther down this road, I might get a hold of them.
Yep.
Do you have any hints for someone like myself who wants to find grants for a project, like where to look, best practices for applying? Like, I get grants is a whole other, like, I'm asking for a short answer here. I realize getting grants is a whole other world, and I can hire,
yeah,
I can investigate that myself. But like any like quick like best practices or clearinghouses, like how do you even find out what grants are available for your field?
Yeah, I would say a couple things right off the top. Get on any mailing lists you possibly can through the USDA. If you go to Department of Ag Conservation and Forestry for the state of Maine or the USDA's website, you can check boxes for your interest areas and they'll deliver an email when new grant programs become available so that they're on your radar. I subscribed to newsletters from the Maine Philanthropy Center because that is a clearinghouse for any foundations and grant makers that want to spread the word about their programs. And that can be a great place to find out about those things. Dial in, just start paying attention to other good work that you respect and admire and pay attention to who's funding them. That gives you ideas about who might fund you if your project is aligned and similar. Those would be my biggest suggestions. It's a very, very common stumbling block that a lot of folks who want grants think that they're not going to be able to get a grant unless they hire a grant writer. Grant writers can be expensive. And honestly, I'm 20 plus years into all of this work. I've only just started paying for some grant writing support because no one can tell your story like you can. You know the passion and mission behind what you want to do, and only you can articulate that. And honestly, until you can articulate it, you probably won't be funded. You got to become a really good storyteller and ambassador to the good work that you're doing. So roll up your sleeves. It's you that's going to write the grants for a while. Someday when you're doing well enough and you can justify that ROI in the investment of a grant writer who needs to match your skill level, then maybe you can afford a grant writer. But that's my 2 cents.
Okay. So you're saying, I feel like I'm hearing I shouldn't use Chat GPT to write my grant application.
I've never done it, but that's a whole new world.
Yeah, I'm not there either. So is there anything that surprised you or that people might not expect that they should be aware of before trying to start a nonprofit?
How would I answer that? I would answer that by saying that I've learned as I've gone along, and I've been involved now at the startup level of nonprofits, at the mid-level maturity of nonprofits, and at very mature levels of nonprofits. Join other boards, learn how they function, learn how boards run meetings, learn about what's necessary by participating in those capacities. At the Maine Grain Alliance, as we were growing and evolving, we eventually hired a facilitator for one of our strategic planning meetings, and he taught us about the life stages of a nonprofit. You have actually very predictable phases of development that you will go through from startup to maturity. Startup is you're still learning to tell your story. There is no home office. We live out of our car. We have all volunteers. We're learning about the roles our board members need to play and what committees are needed. The filing system is a portable box of folders and it's very fledgling, right? And as you become in your kind of adolescent phase of nonprofit board development, you get a little more sophisticated. You start writing policies. You might hire your first director. You get a little more sophisticated. And then at the highest level of functioning, you have a well-articulated mission, a well-oiled machine in terms of how you operate. And what can happen to nonprofits is that the charitable reason that you created yourself in the first place becomes moot. Maybe you solved the problem. Maybe there isn't that problem anymore. And nonprofits sometimes need to completely remake themselves. Or that's a point at which you might want to merge with another nonprofit that now better represents today's problem than the problem you formed to create long ago. Does that make sense? So there's very predictable stages that nonprofits go through, and it's okay if you find yourself struggling through the growth phases. That's part of the process. And it's also okay if you get to a point and you say, we're not needed anymore. We solved that problem that we set out to.
Yeah. I can see how, some nonprofits fulfill their mission and they're done.
That's right.
Okay. I realize we probably don't have time to ask you everything everyone has ever wondered about starting a nonprofit, but are there any guides to starting a nonprofit or anything like that that have been useful to you?
Yes, I have paid attention to workshops offered by the Maine Association of Nonprofits, the Maine Philanthropy Center that I mentioned before. You'll learn about books and resources in those places, but go to some of those. I like a little book that was recommended at a workshop called Boards on Fire all about how to run good meetings and how to keep a board energized around working toward your mission. There's also great books on nonprofit governance and things like that, just crash course guides that can serve as reference tools when you're realizing that, we need to spend a little time on our governance and structure. How do other boards go about that? It's good to have some books and resources like that.
Okay, thanks. You've been really generous with your time this morning, and I really appreciate it. I feel like I've taken a lot away from this conversation, but I wanted to make sure and give you the opportunity before we let you go to ask if there's anything that I should have asked you or that you'd like to say before we let you go.
I think we've covered a lot. It's been a pleasure being with you. And this particular discussion about public-private partnerships, I would just say, go get them. Go see what's possible. Try not to get discouraged. It is a quagmire sometimes. And a funding source can cause you to want to fit a square peg into a round hole. Do I fit what they want me to do? Boy, this money sounds like it's built for me, except for the fact that the nonprofit has to own the land under the posts in the structure. That's very common. So try not to let it discourage you if you're trying to find solutions to your projects and your social missions. It's just how it goes sometimes. Sometimes you have to let a funding source go because there's just too many strings attached. Word of caution generally is just, what's the phrase? Don't let the tail wag the dog. If you have a really clearly defined mission and drive to solve a problem, it'll be easy to tell the story in a fundable way. If you're chasing grants and then you're going to rewrite your story every time the grant comes along just to make sure that they want oranges, so I'm going to be an orange, but tomorrow they want apples, so I'm an apple. Just be careful. That's when you kind of don't contort too much, hold the course, make sure you have a really clearly defined mission and goal.
Yeah. Well, that's good advice. Although, hey, we could plant some orange trees in our greenhouse, right? If they want oranges. So
you want apples, I got apples. You want oranges,
yeah.
I got oranges. Yeah.
Well, that's really good advice. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this stuff, because if anything, I do feel encouraged about this project. And it's at the very least, I want to start going down the road of exploring it as a nonprofit. And yeah, I don't know, maybe nothing's for sure in life. Maybe it won't work out, but it's also now I really do think it's probably the way to do it than to bet my farm on a somewhat risky. I mean, just the fact that experimental is the name, I think conveys that there's an element of risk. So I really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about it. And I think our audience is going to enjoy it too. But before we let you go, can you tell us where people can find you on social media or online or wherever you want them to look you up?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Maine Grains, also on LinkedIn as Amber Lambke. And if folks are interested in learning more about the Kneading Conference, head to kneadingconference.com, KNEADING, kneadingconference.com, hosted by the Maine Grain Alliance.
Yes. Check out the Kneading Conference. I've been a couple times. If you're interested in growing grains and the end product, it's a great thing. If you're anywhere near Skowhegan, come through, check out the mill, have a meal at the miller's table. And really, I just really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about this. And I can't thank you enough, Amber. I know it's not just you. I know there's a whole team, but the projects that you've done have been so great for our town. I'll always be grateful. So thanks for all of that. And it's been fun.
Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate being with you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Growing for Market podcast. If you've been enjoying the show, please consider giving us a follow and a rating or a review. It really helps others find the podcast. For more tips and tricks from farmer to farmer, check out our magazine at growingformarket.com. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market magazine for the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of market farming. We publish 10 issues per year with articles written by experienced farmers on topics ranging from tools and techniques to farm business operations and marketing. If you've been listening to the Growing for Market podcast and haven't yet checked out Growing for Market magazine, we've made a change so you can try the magazine for free. We've added a free month to the beginning of all first-time subscriptions. Try out the digital or paper magazine for a month, and if it's not for you, cancel within 28 days and you'll never even get billed. All subscriptions get you a year of the magazine, plus 150 downloadable back issues from the last 15 years and over 1,700 archived articles. With digital subscriptions starting at just $39 a year, head on over to growingformarket.com and subscribe today to benefit from over 3 decades of writing by farmers, for farmers, in Growing for Market magazine.